Peter, there's something I want to ask that I almost feel not sure if I could say this out loud, but let me ask you since you seem open to this. If we ask the audience, what do you think about the donut industry? Everyone would say, they're just trying to make money. I don't feel good about it. If I said, what about the soda industry? 100%, everyone's in. If I said, what about the pepperoni and salami business? Total agreement. Fossil fuels, total agreement. What about the, Monsanto and the chemicals? We could get everyone to agree. But then there's this one question that follows. It's like everything else, but yet we completely lose the audience and everyone says, what are you talking about? And that question is, and I'm not sure you're supposed to say this out loud, but is it possible that pharmaceutical drugs don't really work, that the negatives of them outweigh the benefit to the point that, with the exception of, let's take antibiotics off the table, but aside from antibiotics, and I assume there's amazing drugs to, for certain things, but for so many of the drugs out there, is it possible that every doctor who's smart and intelligent and honest is being misled by clinical trials, medical journals, and studies that are not accurate, and the entire, the whole business of pharmaceutical drugs is mostly based on clinical trials that were tampered with to the point that they're not accurate? Is it possible that most drugs are actually worse than the benefit? Or help me how to think about this. Are pharmaceutical drugs mostly like donuts? I mean, help me.
Well, I don't think there's any question about it. I don't think there's any question about this at all. I mean, there's so many ways to look at it. Why do we give a certain amount of drug for blood pressure? Because a committee got together, made up of people mostly endowed by the pharmaceutical industry to keep rising the levels of what is hypertension or what is blood sugar. All of these things that bring in more and more drugs throughout. In every place you look, they are under the sway of the dollar. I couldn't believe it when I first started looking into what was going on in psychiatry. Everybody, not everybody, maybe 80% of the panel members of the committees that advise the FDA are given letters exonerating them from their conflicts of interest because they have them and they don't want to get sued. Otherwise, they wouldn't be on the panels. I just couldn't believe that. Everywhere you look at the sliding door between who gets hired by the FDA up top, which are the pharmaceutical people, and then the people at the top of the FDA retire and they go out and work for the pharmaceutical companies. You can't look anywhere where this corruption hasn't taken place. And the dollar is just almighty. When psychotherapy started to really take off and women started entering the field, it happened because the insurance companies stopped forcing non-medical people to have medical supervision. So you could be a social worker, you could get a certain amount of money. So, who would start in California? And what California woman isn't going to want to go to another woman rather than to some male guy with all these things on his wall who's even more objectifying of her than her poor husband is? So the system started to collapse. They weren't getting enough members into APA, Psychiatric Association, because they were going to see women more and more throughout the country. APA, I document this in Toxic Psychiatry in the minutes, said, what are we going to do? They said, we're going to go and collaborate with the drug companies. And with that, psychiatrists stopped doing psychotherapy. They stopped teaching it. It wasn't going to be the money maker. There have been decent psychotherapy is hardly taught at all. In some places, not at all. I mean, the whole system. I sent a letter to the New York Times at one point because they asked, why did George Bush, why was he allowed to take Halcyon? Because he'd gone to see the premier of Japan, and he'd gotten sick. He'd vomited at the table. It was first the elder, dignified George Bush. And so and why was it outlawed in Great Britain? And they didn't even know that the drug causes paranoia. Our president's taking Halcyon on his flight over for sleep, and it causes paranoia. He's going to go and visit in Japan. So I wrote them a letter, and I sent them a picture, and I said, here's the Upjohn Company, the maker, giving $1 million check to the American Psychiatric Association with no holds barred at all. They can do whatever they want with it. So the medical director writes back to the APA, and this is pertinent to your question, there are no conspiracies. The APA medical director writes back and says, Dr. Breggin doesn't understand. We have an ethical partnership with the drug companies. That's in writing. About conspiracy, people plan. NFL owners plan. Business people plan. Everybody who has power plans to consolidate, to increase their power. And when you have this huge power, this medical industrial complex, like Dwight Eisenhower's military industrial complex, you plan. You plan with the other presidents. You plan with everybody you can get your hands on. And maybe it's not conspiracy. It's planning, and it's covert planning. Really. I don't mean to be so feverish about this, but I mean, I live in this world. Thank you, God, for being alive.
So just to follow up, because...
and the trials, they all suck in my field. They did a 3-week trial to get an amphetamine. Oh, I need that. An amphetamine approved to give it to children. 3 weeks. I mean, it's appalling. Now, the average doctor, he doesn't know anything about this, but the average human being doesn't know anything about what's going on in the world. And the average doctor, I don't know if they're any better. I've always been looking for better people somewhere. I don't know if they're any better than other people. But the information they're getting is not just because of a system, it's a huge organization of money.
So I know now that what this panel is about, so we'll start going that way then. So
I'll stop. I wasn't
No,
going that way
I love
until
hearing
you
this.
said no evil, no conspiracies. What world am I in?
context. You're 81 years old. You recognize context. No, I worked with Tommy Thompson. You remember Tommy Thompson? He was the Secretary of Health and Human Services. I was the one that actually created the whole healthcare system of Afghanistan in 2001 and 2002. And I worked with Julie Gerberding. So he's right in the sense that guess where they're working now? Every FDA director, CDC director, HHS director, after they leave, guess where they get jobs? Yeah. So I understand the evil, but I just didn't want to go in that direction. It's just
Well, thank you,
too
Dan.
evil.
I really appreciate you're not just, dissing me.
No, of course not. Of course not. Speaking to his statement that why is everybody else not doing it? It's a machine. Part of it is the evil. I'll leave that to him. He's good with the evil. Part of it is the machine. Aspirin, biggest drug out there. What's the number needed to treat? NNT. Meaning that how many people do you have to give aspirin where one person avoids a first stroke or one person avoids a first heart attack? More than 1,600 people. Yeah. So, and then another way they manipulate. Oh, you got me started now.
Good. This is, are you glad?
We're gonna get sued. We're gonna get sued together. Yeah.
This is the
There's-
first time
in
I ever had a
science,
good
there
effect
is-
on a panel.
In science, there is the. Well, real truth is vast and wide. You can talk about systematic, conspiracy, a whole range of things. I mean, I could talk about the kale, and there would be real truth in kale. But in science, you do a kind of thing called absolute risk reduction and relative risk reduction. And in cholesterol, they would say there's a 33% risk reduction in using this drug. What they were doing was they were doing relative risk reduction and not absolute risk reduction. The absolute risk reduction was without the drug, you had 3% chance, and with the drug, it would go down to 2%, right? That's the absolute risk reduction of
Important.
1%. But when you do relative risk reduction, they counted it as 33%. So that's how they reported it.
So important.
So there's a lot of manipulation. Yeah.
So I would like to clarify one thing. I would like very much for this conference to be credible. I don't want people to say, oh, it's a UFO conference, they're a bunch of... So this isn't the anti-conference. I'm not against saying the alternative is good and the mainstream is bad. I just want to understand one thing. I am crystal clear that the candy industry wants to sell me candy and doesn't care about my health. I'm crystal clear that the soda industry, this breakfast cereal industry, the salt industry, the high fructose corn syrup, they want to make sales, they don't care about me. I want to understand one thing. I am trying, and I don't want, and it's okay to say I'm way out, I don't understand this. I don't know how many pharmaceutical drugs are on the market. I'd like to know how many are on the market and how many are actually more beneficial than harmful. In other words, if it's true that all these doctors are getting their education from clinical trials and medical journals and med school, and you're saying that clinical trials are a broken system, and when the study that the doctor uses was not a real study, it was a manipulated study, then no matter how smart, honest, and good intentioned that doctor is, he had bad information. So what I want to understand is, are the pharmaceutical drugs that we all take and all believe in and we're all told by the doctor, is it all based on data that was fudged, that was manipulated, that was tricked? What is the reality of how we should think about the pharmaceutical drug? Let's take antibiotics off the table and think about all the others. How should we be thinking about when we're prescribed a pharmaceutical drug?
Well, in psychiatry, I'll be brief. In psychiatry, it's all fudged. Every last trial. They are too short, first of all, 6 or 7 weeks, so it's meaningless. So they're all fudged. They're all farmed out to doctors who the companies hire, and the doctors are going to deliver, and it's pretty easy to deliver. The protocols are written by the drug companies, and they're written by the marketing department, really, in many ways, because they're figuring out how to make the trial come out so you can market the drug. I mean, it's not very complicated. The entire process. If a doctor wants to publish an article saying the drug didn't work, he's prohibited from doing it if he's been a part of the trial. The so-called scientist, who's the principal investigator, does not himself evaluate the data. The data is evaluated at the drug company, and then when the article comes out, in a large percentage of cases, and if you Google this, you'll get articles looking at the percentages, but a big proportion are ghost-written. Doctors are paid to put their names on an article written inside the drug company. And that is the status quo within the area that I know so horribly well. It is none of it reliable, and that's the only way you can make believe that a neurotoxin is good for people with emotional problems. Did I answer? That's just my feel. I don't know the other ones really well.
In my field, I agree with you. When it comes to psychotropic drugs or medication for mood and psychiatry, there's a lot of gray area, and I think you know it better than anyone else. In my field, I deal with a lot of stroke patients. So stroke, for some of you that don't know what stroke is, usually a clot blocks the path of blood in one of the arteries in the brain, and an area of the brain doesn't get oxygen and nutrition, and it dies. It's an emergency. People come in, and we get paged, we're running around, trying to make sure that we get to that person as soon as possible, because we have this one drug called TPA, which is a clot-busting medication. And that person can get that clot-busting medication between 3 to 4.5 hours. Anything beyond that, then they won't be eligible for it, because it actually causes more harm than cure. At times, when the person comes in within that time period and they get TPA, their symptoms are completely reversed. They actually gain function of their arm and their leg. And if they go past that hour, they go to a neurointerventional radiologist. And what they do is they puncture your groin, they go into your artery, they get into the artery in the brain, they identify the clot, and then they pull it out. Yes, it's very invasive. Yes, it's very expensive, but it does save lives. Let me give you another example. When in the emergency, somebody comes in and they have an acute bleed in their brain. Their blood pressure was so high, it was, say, for example, 220/110. The artery that was already riddled with cholesterol plaques because they didn't really care about that hamburger they were eating over and over again for the past 10 years, caused it. And so that artery ruptures, and in the emergency room, we run to the patient to lower down their blood pressure because it actually controls the size of the bleed. They can die. The mortality related to hemorrhagic strokes or bleed in the brain is very, very high. But when you reduce their blood pressure right away, when you manage their glucose levels, which is usually raging high, and when you make sure that you get diagnostics to control the size of the hemorrhage by giving them, hypertonic saline, which is like lots of sodium, you actually shrink the size of the bleed. So those are medications that actually mean life and death. They work. And they do work. They do work. Are they necessary? Absolutely. Have they helped save people? Absolutely. I do this every single day in the emergency room. But is that the answer for everything else? Absolutely not. Cholesterol medication. When somebody has a stroke, we put them on a very high dose of cholesterol medication because they come in with an LDL of 200. Obviously, I want to lower it as soon as possible because I know that within the next 48 hours, they'll have another stroke and they'll die. And so for me, looking at that entire person, their family, their children, their whole story, my mission is to make sure that they live. And I use whatever I can to make them live. And it does work. But at the same time, even though they can't talk, they have a tube in their mouth and they say, when you get better, I'm going to talk to you about diet and exercise, okay? See you later. And I understand that that's not the long-term answer for making sure that people, live a healthy lifestyle, but they do work. They do work.
In my field.
May I ask you a question? By the way, of course, I agree with you about emergency medicine. I think that that's the one place most of us can agree on is the emergency life-saving medicine. My impression of the cholesterol studies and the 200, for example, somebody having a 200, and maybe there's new data, but when I looked at it and when a friend of mine, Tom Moore, wrote a book on it years ago, it was all loaded for people with very pathological cholesterols of like 500. And when somebody was trying to tell me to take the prescription fish oil, I looked at some of the data, and first of all, it had a lot of adverse effects. I was really surprised at that, but it was at large doses that were under the pharmaceutical industry. And again, it seemed to be skewed to people who almost never get there, which are these large numbers. So I don't know if it's true that a 200 cholesterol is going to vastly increase anybody's risk of anything. I don't know if you know the data. I certainly don't mean to put you on the spot.
Well, no, we do actually have very clear data that high cholesterol increases your chance for Alzheimer's disease, and in stroke specifically.
No, I meant stroke. Yeah, I was thinking more, not of Alzheimer's, but of the
cardiovascular disease. I think there is data, and it's been repeated and it's been validated in multiple studies, and there have even been some clinical trials that have used statins in the setting of an acute stroke by lowering cholesterol levels, bad cholesterol levels, drastically within the first few days, and then continuing it for a couple of weeks actually lowers chances of mortality related to stroke. There was a Sparkle trial which looked at the pleiotropic effect or the anti-inflammatory effects of statins during acute stroke, and it looks like it actually shrinks the size of the penumbra, which is the area of the brain that is shocked after a stroke. It definitely decreases the size. But again, I'll preface it by saying that is not the long-term answer.
Right.
More patients actually get out of our clinic without medication than they actually came in. We said lifestyle is the long-term answer, but if you're so sick where we don't really have a lot of tools to do, I want to make sure you live, and I'm going to use whatever I have.
For my disease, none of the drugs work for what people think they work for. Aricept, Exelon, Namenda, they don't slow the disease or stop the disease. There's no question. Not even the pharmaceutical companies say that. Yet, everybody that comes to me from a general practitioner says, the doctor gave me this to slow the disease. It doesn't. So if it doesn't slow the disease, why do we keep going in the same direction? Yet we showed you data after data after data that lifestyle significantly reduces it. Now, where is the problem again? When it comes to the pharmaceutical, in this case, they want to do research and raise money from NIH and other directions on a molecular basis because it's easier to target. And that's why we keep missing the target. That's where the flaw or evil, whatever we want to call it. I'll pick whatever word. And then the mechanism is that we just don't want to focus on lifestyle. So where does the responsibility fall? I agree with you. A greedy system creates a system.
Talking to the microphone.
A greedy system is a system that will do whatever, true or false, and usually it's more expedient to do the false easy thing to make money. That's true. I'm not arguing with that at all. A system that is based on medicine is going to push whatever tool it has to make money. That means the doctors are part of this, not because they're evil, because otherwise they're left with, well, why am I getting paid? So they're going to give you medicine. And even if medicines that don't have any significant benefit, and hospitals and all of these systems. And the research machine that's only interested in clinical trials that last 5 years, focus on a molecule, they get their grants, and at the end, even if there's a minuscule change, then they'll take it. Because the more complex lifestyle is going to take billions of dollars to do research. So at all steps, there seems to be a flaw. So I agree with you and myself.
So, before I move on, I just want to take one more try to, and it's okay if no one knows this answer. Taking out emergency medicine, taking out antibiotics. If clinical trials are not accurate, doesn't that mean that every doctor, no matter how smart, honest, credentialed, and fantastic they are, and honest, if someone is saying clearly that the system of clinical trials is a broken system, and this is how people decide what medicines to prescribe, doesn't that mean that we have to be very uncomfortable with all the medical recommendations? I'm just trying to understand, what's the basis when the doctor says to me, take these drugs, if he's basing it on a clinical trial? If you're saying the clinical trials are trustworthy, then that all makes sense. But if you're saying we have a clinical trial system where they can do 10 trials, kick out the 7 they don't like, keep the 3 they want, doesn't that mean that every single time someone's given a drug, forget about emergency medicine, forget about antibiotics, doesn't that mean that he's making a recommendation to me based on very flawed information? Help me how to think about this.
I've answered, so go ahead.
We are always making flawed and partial decisions throughout history. When we first started with the first set of drugs, they were incredibly blunt drugs, bromide, blunt drugs, and that was the best we had. The problem was not the drug; it did its job. The problem was with explaining how much good it's doing and how much bad it's doing, and people just assumed since it was coming from a doctor that it did more good than bad. That wasn't always true. So we can't just lump everything into one category. There were drugs that were a little more effective and harmful, some that was less. And we became better and better and better. That's one problem. And now with cancer, we're actually going completely different paradigm now. We're using targeted ligand or targeted approach, antibody-directed approaches to cancer, which is very different than 5 years ago. We were just talking to an oncologist on the plane. He's saying that from 2 years ago, I'm practicing completely different than now because it's completely targeted approach now. And in 5 years, it will be so much more different. Up to now, we've been giving poisons to people and hoping the cells that reproduce faster would consume poisons more, so they would die at faster rate than your regular cells. We all knew this, but that was all we had, and we took it. and there was different levels of utility. Some drugs were worse, some drugs were better, some pharmaceutical companies lied, some didn't and exaggerated. So the whole spectrum. There's no one thing. And we're evolving. The next level will be more targeted, more precise. And that's the way it is. And there will be still lying, there will still be cheating, there will still be stealing. But I just want to kind of paint the picture to be a little more broad than, the one element that we're always missing. The other element is research. You could be hitting a target 50 times out of 50 times. But if the target is here and it's supposed to be there, you're hitting the wrong target. That's what we're doing a lot of times, not all the time, a lot of times in pharmaceuticals and in research.